The morning sun cast a golden glow over Kensington Palace as Prince William stepped out onto the private balcony of his apartment. The early October air carried a crisp promise of autumn, and the leaves in the palace gardens were just beginning to turn their brilliant shades of amber and scarlet. William had always found solace in these quiet moments before the day officially began, before the endless stream of royal duties, public appearances, and ceremonial obligations took over his life. As he sipped his morning tea, William's thoughts wandered to the letter that had arrived 3 days earlier. It wasn't unusual for members of the royal family to receive thousands of pieces of correspondence each week, but this particular letter had somehow made its way through the careful screening process and landed directly on his desk. The envelope bore the careful handwriting of someone who had taken great care with each letter, and when William had opened it, he discovered it contained something that would change not just his day, but the lives of countless others. The letter was from Margaret Thompson, an 87-year-old widow from a small town in Yorkshire. Her handwriting was shaky but determined, telling the story of her late husband's military service and their 63 years of marriage. What struck William most profoundly was not the request for a royal visit or a photograph, but rather Margaret's simple wish to share her husband's story and to let the royal family know how much their public service had meant to her family over the decades. Margaret wrote about how she and her husband Harold had met during the Second World War when he was stationed near her village. She described their courtship through letters, their wedding in a small church with only immediate family present due to wartime restrictions, and the challenges they faced rebuilding their lives after the war ended. Harold had worked as a postman for 42 years, walking the same routes through their Yorkshire town, delivering letters that connected families, brought news of births and deaths, and carried love across distances. But what truly captured William's attention was Margaret's description of her current situation. After Harold's death 2 years earlier, she found herself completely alone. Their only child, a son, had died in a car accident 15 years ago, and they had never had grandchildren. Margaret's daily routine now consisted of tending to her small garden, reading the same books over and over, and watching the television programs that she and Harold used to enjoy together. She had written to the royal family not to complain or ask for help, but simply to share her story with someone who might understand the weight of public service and dedication to others. The letter concluded with Margaret mentioning that she had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and was facing the prospect of moving into a care facility within the next few months. She wanted to give away Harold's collection of military medals and memorabilia to someone who would appreciate their historical significance, and she had thought perhaps a royal museum might be interested. She signed the letter simply, with deepest respect and admiration, Margaret Thompson. William had read the letter 3 times that first day, each time feeling a growing sense of connection to this woman he had never met. There was something about Margaret's dignity in the face of overwhelming loneliness, her grace in dealing with loss, and her continued faith in the institutions and people she admired that reminded him of his own grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the countless other individuals who had dedicated their lives to service without expecting recognition or reward. That evening, William had shared the letter with Catherine during their private dinner. The children were already in bed, and the couple had settled into their favorite chairs in the sitting room, surrounded by family photos and the comfortable disorder of a home where 3 young children lived and played. Catherine had listened quietly as William read Margaret's word aloud, and when he finished, she had tears in her eyes. "We have to do something," Catherine had said softly, her voice filled with the same determination that had drawn William to her more than 2 decades earlier. "This isn't about duty or protocol. This is about human decency and kindness." William nodded. No, they had both grown up with privilege and responsibility, but they had also been raised to understand that true nobility came not from titles or wealth, but from how one treated others, especially those who had no expectation of kindness or attention. The next morning, William had called his private secretary and asked him to research Margaret Thompson's situation more thoroughly. What they discovered only reinforced William and Catherine's initial instincts. Margaret lived in a small cottage that had been her home for over 50 years, situated at the end of a quiet lane in a village that most people would drive through without noticing. Her neighbors spoke of her as a woman who had spent decades caring for others, volunteering at the local church, organizing food drives for struggling families, and serving as an unofficial grandmother figure to children whose own grandparents lived far away or had passed on. The cottage itself was small but meticulously maintained, with a garden that had once been Margaret's pride and joy but was now becoming too much for her to manage alone. The roses that she and Harold had planted on their first wedding anniversary still bloomed each summer, though they were becoming wild and unruly without proper care. Inside, the house was filled with 63 years of shared memories, photographs covering every available surface, and Harold's military uniforms hanging carefully preserved in their bedroom wardrobe. Margaret's neighbors reported that she rarely left the cottage except for essential errands and weekly visits to Harold's grave in the village churchyard. The local postman, who happened to be the grandson of one of Harold's former colleagues, made sure to stop for a brief chat whenever he delivered her mail, understanding that these few minutes of conversation might be the only human interaction Margaret had on any given day. The care facility that Margaret was preparing to enter was well regarded and comfortable, but it was also located 30 miles away from everything she had ever known. The move would mean leaving behind not only her home and garden, but also Harold's grave and the community where she had spent her entire adult life. The facility staff were kind and professional, but they were caring for dozens of residents, and Margaret understood that she would become just another elderly woman spending her final years in a place where routine took precedence over individual attention. As William learned more about Margaret's situation, he began to form an idea. It started as a simple notion of making a private visit to thank her for her letter and perhaps arrange for her husband's military collection to be properly honored. But as he discussed the possibilities with Catherine, the idea began to evolve into something more significant and meaningful. Catherine suggested that they might be able to help Margaret in ways that went beyond a simple visit. Perhaps they could find ways to support her desire to remain in her own home for as long as possible, or connect her with local resources and volunteers who could provide companionship and assistance. William realized that Margaret's situation was not unique, that across the United Kingdom, thousands of elderly people were facing similar challenges of isolation, loneliness, and the difficult transition from independence to institutional care. What if their response to Margaret's letter could become something larger? What if they could use their position and influence to highlight the challenges facing elderly people throughout the country and inspire others to reach out to isolated members of their own communities? William and Catherine had always believed that their royal platform was most valuable when it could shine light on important issues and encourage positive action from others. The more they discussed their plans, the more excited they became about the possibilities. This wouldn't be a typical royal visit with formal protocols and carefully planned photo opportunities. Instead, they wanted to create an authentic human connection that would demonstrate the power of simple kindness and personal attention. They would visit Margaret not as the Prince and Princess of Wales, but as two people who had been moved by her story and wanted to honor her life and her husband's service. William's private secretary initially expressed concerns about the lack of formal structure and the potential security complications of an unannounced visit to a private residence. But William and Catherine were determined to approach this differently. They wanted their interaction with Margaret to feel natural and genuine, not like a carefully orchestrated public relations event. They were willing to deal with the logistical challenges if it meant they could create a meaningful experience for someone who had spent her life caring for others. As they finalized their plans, William and Catherine decided that they would not publicize the visit in advance. They would travel to Yorkshire quietly, spend time with Margaret in her own home, and only later share the story if Margaret was comfortable with public attention. Their goal was not to generate positive media coverage for themselves, but to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful gestures are the simplest ones, performed without fanfare or expectation of recognition. The decision to keep the visit private initially was also motivated by their desire to protect Margaret from unwanted attention or pressure. They understood that sudden media interest could be overwhelming for someone in her position, and they wanted to ensure that any public discussion of their visit would be on Margaret's terms and with her full consent. On the morning they planned to leave for Yorkshire, William stood once again on his balcony, watching the sun rise over London. In a few hours, he and Catherine would begin a journey that felt different from any royal engagement they had undertaken before. They were traveling not to fulfill an official duty or attend a state function, but to respond to the heartfelt letter of one elderly woman who had taken the time to share her story with strangers. As William prepared for the day ahead, he reflected on the lessons his mother had tried to teach him about the true purpose of royal service. Princess Diana had always emphasized that their privileged position came with the responsibility to care for those who might otherwise be forgotten or overlooked. She had shown him that the most meaningful moments of royal life often occurred away from the cameras and ceremonies, in quiet interactions with individuals who needed to know that someone cared about their struggles and valued their contributions. Now, as he prepared to visit Margaret Thompson, William felt that he was finally understanding what his mother had meant. This visit to a small cottage in Yorkshire might never make headlines or be remembered in official histories, but it represented everything that royal service should aspire to be: personal, genuine, and focused entirely on the needs and dignity of others. The morning sun climbed higher as William finished his tea and prepared to wake Catherine and begin their journey north. Neither of them could have imagined that their simple response to one woman's letter would soon capture the attention and hearts of people not just across Britain, but around the world. They were about to discover that authentic kindness, when performed without calculation or publicity, has a power that extends far beyond the immediate recipients and touches everyone who witnesses it. As William walked back into the palace, Margaret Thompson was beginning her own morning routine 300 miles away in Yorkshire, completely unaware that her quiet letter had set in motion events that would soon change not only her life, but inspire countless others to examine their own capacity for kindness and human connection. The drive through the Yorkshire countryside was unlike any journey William and Catherine had taken together in their official capacity. Instead of the usual convoy of security vehicles and police escorts, they traveled in a single unmarked car with just 2 protection officers following discreetly behind. The autumn landscape rolled past their windows in waves of gold and russet, and for the first time in months, both felt the simple pleasure of traveling without the weight of formal protocol dictating every moment. Catherine had spent the previous evening researching Margaret's village, learning about its history and the challenges facing rural communities throughout Yorkshire. She discovered that Margaret's town was one of hundreds struggling with the departure of young people seeking opportunities in larger cities, leaving behind an increasingly aging population with limited resources and support systems. The local post office had closed 3 years earlier, forcing residents to travel 12 miles for basic banking services. The village school had been consolidated with a larger facility in the neighboring town, and the weekly bus service had been reduced to just 2 days. As they approached Margaret's village, William and Catherine began to understand the isolation that had shaped her letter. The cottage was exactly as they had imagined from the description provided by William's secretary, but seeing it in person made Margaret's situation feel even more poignant. The small stone building sat at the end of a narrow lane, surrounded by a garden that showed signs of loving care despite its current overgrown state. Roses climbed the walls around the front door, their late-season blooms adding splashes of pink and white to the gray stone facade. When William knocked gently on the front door, the woman who answered looked exactly like the photograph his staff had found in the local newspaper archives from Harold's funeral service. Margaret Thompson stood barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair carefully styled and wearing a navy dress that spoke of decades-old fashion but impeccable maintenance. Her eyes, a startling blue despite her advanced age, widened in recognition and then confusion as she processed the unexpected appearance of the Prince and Princess of Wales on her doorstep. "Your Royal Highnesses," Margaret whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her heart. "I don't understand. How did you find me?" Catherine stepped forward with a warm smile that had endeared her to millions. "Mrs. Thompson, we received your beautiful letter about Harold and your life together. We were so moved by your words that we wanted to meet you in person, and thank you for sharing your story with us." The next few minutes unfolded with the careful choreography of people trying to navigate an entirely unprecedented situation. Margaret invited them inside with the automatic courtesy of her generation, apologizing repeatedly for the state of her cottage despite the fact that everything was spotlessly clean and carefully arranged. William and Catherine assured her that no apology was necessary, while taking in the remarkable collection of memories that filled every corner of the small rooms. The sitting room was a shrine to 63 years of shared life. Photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, chronicling Harold and Margaret's journey from young newlyweds to middle-aged parents to elderly companions. Wedding pictures showed a serious young man in military uniform standing beside a radiant bride in a simple white dress. Holiday snapshots captured family trips to the seaside, Christmas mornings with their son opening presents under a modest tree, and quiet moments in their garden over the decades. Harold's military medals were displayed in a place of honor on the wall, along with commendations from his postal service career and certificates recognizing Margaret's volunteer work with various church and community organizations. The cottage felt like a museum of ordinary life lived with extraordinary dedication and love, and both William and Catherine found themselves deeply moved by the tangible evidence of Margaret's commitment to preserving these memories. Margaret prepared tea with hands that shook slightly, but moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times for countless guests. She brought out her best china, pieces that had been wedding gifts and had survived decades of careful use for special occasions. As they sat around her small kitchen table, Margaret began to share stories that brought the photographs and memorabilia to life. She told them about Harold's return from the war and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life when rationing was still in effect and jobs were scarce. She described the early years of their marriage when they lived with Harold's parents while saving money for their own home, and the excitement of finally purchasing the cottage where she still lived. Margaret's voice grew stronger and more animated as she remembered their son's childhood, Harold's dedication to his postal route, and the countless small moments that had comprised their life together. William found himself particularly drawn to Margaret's descriptions of Harold's work as a postman. She explained how Harold had known every resident on his route personally, remembering birthdays and anniversaries, checking on elderly neighbors during harsh winters, and serving as an informal communication network for the community. Harold had often been the first to know when families were celebrating good news or struggling with difficulties, and he had taken his role as messenger and confidant seriously. Harold always said that delivering mail was about more than just carrying letters, Margaret explained, her eyes brightening with the memory. He believed he was connecting people to each other and to the wider world. During the years when telephone calls were expensive and not everyone had easy access to transportation, Harold was often the only link some people had of family members living far away. Catherine asked about Margaret's own work and discovered that she had spent decades volunteering at the local church, organizing food drives during difficult economic periods, and serving as an unofficial counselor for young mothers in the community. Margaret had never held formal employment outside the home, but her unpaid contributions to community welfare had touched hundreds of lives over the years. She had taught Sunday school for 30 years, coordinated holiday celebrations for families who couldn't afford elaborate festivities, and maintained a network of elderly residents who relied on her for companionship and practical assistance. As they talked, Margaret's initial nervousness gave way to the natural grace that had characterized her interactions with neighbors and community members throughout her life. She seemed to forget that she was entertaining royalty and instead treated William and Catherine as she would any visitors who had shown interest in her life and memories. She brought out photograph albums and shared stories about specific images, explaining the context behind seemingly ordinary snapshots and revealing the deep love and commitment that had sustained her marriage. William was particularly moved by Margaret's description of Harold's final months. She explained how dementia had gradually taken away his memory and personality while leaving her to care for him alone in their cottage. Margaret had refused to consider institutional care for Harold, instead learning to manage his medications, assist with his daily needs, and maintain their home while watching the man she loved disappear little by little. I knew that if our situations had been reversed, Harold would never have given up on me, Margaret said simply. We had promised to care for each other in sickness and health, and I intended to honor that promise regardless of how difficult things became. The final year of Harold's life had been the most challenging period Margaret had ever experienced. Harold's confusion and agitation had made sleep nearly impossible, and Margaret had found herself providing round-the-clock care while dealing with her own grief over the loss of her companion's personality and memories. The local doctor had offered referrals to care facilities, but Margaret had been determined to keep Harold at home, where he would be surrounded by familiar objects and routines. Margaret described the morning when Harold had died peacefully in their bedroom, looking out at the garden they had tended together for so many years. She had been holding his hand when he took his final breath, and despite her grief, she had felt grateful that she had been able to fulfill her promise to care for him until the end. The funeral had been attended by dozens of community members whose lives Harold had touched during his postal career, and Margaret had been overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support from neighbors who understood what she had lost. As the afternoon progressed, William and Catherine began to understand more fully the depth of Margaret's current isolation. She explained that while neighbors remained kind and considerate, most were dealing with their own aging-related challenges and had limited time or energy for extended social interaction. The weekly trip to Harold's grave had become her primary reason for leaving the cottage, and even that was becoming more difficult as her vision and mobility declined. Margaret's impending move to the care facility was clearly weighing heavily on her mind. She had visited the location and found the staff professional and caring, but she was struggling with the reality of leaving behind everything that connected her to Harold and their shared life. The facility's policies would allow her to bring only a small selection of personal belongings, which meant that most of her photographs, Harold's memorabilia, and the furniture they had chosen together would have to be sold or given away. I understand that the move is necessary, Margaret said, her voice becoming quieter. My memory isn't what it used to be, and I sometimes forget to eat or take my medications. The doctors think I'll be safer with people to look after me. But this cottage holds 63 years of memories, and I'm not sure how to say goodbye to all of that. Catherine reached across the table and gently took Margaret's hand. Mrs. Thompson, would you mind if we talked about some ways we might be able to help you? We can't change the medical realities you're facing, but perhaps we could find ways to make this transition easier and ensure that Harold's memory and service are properly honored. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, clearly overwhelmed by the kindness being shown by two people she had never expected to meet. William explained that they had already been in contact with several military museums that would be honored to receive Harold's medals and memorabilia, ensuring that his service would be remembered and displayed with the respect it deserved. They had also spoken with local organizations about creating a memorial garden in the village that could serve as a lasting tribute to Harold and other community members who had dedicated their lives to service. But beyond these formal gestures, William and Catherine had been working on something more personal. They had contacted the care facility where Margaret would be living and arranged for her to have a private room large enough to accommodate more personal belongings than typically allowed. They had also established a fund that would enable the facility to provide specialized memory care services and regular transportation for Margaret to visit Harold's grave whenever she wanted. Most importantly, they had reached out to local volunteer organizations to establish a support network that would ensure Margaret's final months in her cottage would be filled with companionship and assistance. Volunteers would help maintain her garden, provide transportation for errands and social activities, and offer daily check-ins to ensure her safety and well-being. The goal was to allow Margaret to remain in her own home for as long as medically advisable, while building the social connections that would make her eventual transition to care less traumatic. As evening approached, William and Catherine realized they had spent nearly 6 hours in Margaret's cottage, far longer than originally planned. But neither felt any desire to cut the visit short. They had come expecting to spend an hour or two offering comfort to an isolated elderly woman, but instead had found themselves enriched by Margaret's stories, wisdom, and example of lifelong commitment and service. Margaret prepared a simple dinner using ingredients she happened to have on hand, apologizing again for the modest meal, while William and Catherine assured her that sharing her table was an honor they would never forget. As they ate together in the small kitchen, surrounded by 63 years of accumulated memories, all three understood that something extraordinary was taking place. This was not a royal engagement or a charitable obligation, but a genuine human connection that transcended titles and social differences. As the sun began to set over the Yorkshire countryside, William and Catherine knew they would need to begin their journey back to London. But they also understood that their relationship with Margaret Thompson was just beginning, and that their simple response to her letter had opened doors to possibilities none of them had imagined when the day began. The transformation that began with William and Catherine's visit to Margaret Thompson's cottage would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of one small Yorkshire village. Unknown to any of them at the time, Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had noticed the unusual activity at the cottage that afternoon. Eleanor, who had been Margaret's closest friend since Harold's death, had been watching from her kitchen window when the unmarked cars arrived and had been curious about Margaret's unexpected visitors. Eleanor had lived next to Margaret and Harold for 28 years and had developed the protective instincts that elderly neighbors often share. When she saw well-dressed strangers arriving at Margaret's cottage and staying for hours, she became concerned about potential scams targeting vulnerable elderly residents. It wasn't until she glimpsed William's profile through Margaret's kitchen window that she realized the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding next door. After William and Catherine's departure, Eleanor hurried over to check on Margaret, expecting to find her friend confused or overwhelmed by the unexpected visit. Instead, she discovered Margaret in the highest spirits she had seen since Harold's death. Margaret was practically glowing with joy as she recounted every detail of the afternoon, from the moment she answered her door to find royalty on her doorstep to the promise of ongoing support and Harold's proper recognition. "Eleanor, you won't believe what happened," Margaret said, her hands trembling with excitement rather than age as she poured tea for her friend. "They came because of my letter. They actually read my letter about Harold and decided to visit me personally, not for photographs or publicity, but just to hear about our life and to honor Harold's memory." Eleanor listened in amazement as Margaret described the conversation they had shared, the genuine interest William and Catherine had shown in Harold's military service and postal career, and the practical support they had arranged for Margaret's remaining time in the cottage and her eventual transition to care. What struck Eleanor most powerfully was not the royal involvement, but the evident transformation in her friend's demeanor and outlook. For 2 years, Eleanor had watched Margaret struggle with grief, loneliness, and the overwhelming prospect of leaving everything familiar behind. Margaret had seemed to be slowly fading, becoming smaller and more isolated with each passing month. But now, energized by the validation and kindness she had received, Margaret appeared to have rediscovered her sense of purpose and dignity. Eleanor had always been active in local church and community affairs, and she understood immediately that Margaret's story was exactly the kind of inspiration their struggling village needed to hear. She asked Margaret's permission to share the news with their pastor and a few close friends, not to create publicity for the royal visit, but to demonstrate how individual acts of kindness could transform lives and communities. Margaret agreed, with the understanding that any sharing of her story would focus on the importance of recognizing elderly community members and honoring the service of ordinary people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. She was particularly eager to ensure that Harold's military service and postal career would be remembered as examples of the quiet heroism that characterized his generation. Within days, word of the royal visit had spread through the village and into neighboring communities. But rather than creating a media circus, the story inspired something much more powerful and lasting. Local residents began reaching out to isolated elderly neighbors, offering assistance with daily tasks, companionship, and practical support. The village church organized a program connecting younger community members with elderly residents who needed help maintaining their homes and gardens. The regional newspaper picked up the story a week later, but their coverage focused on the broader implications of the royal visit rather than sensationalizing the event itself. The article highlighted the challenges facing elderly residents in rural communities throughout Yorkshire and celebrated the grassroots response that Margaret's story had inspired. The headline read, "A Letter's Legacy: How Royal Kindness Sparked Community Action," and featured interviews with volunteers who had been motivated by Margaret's experience to examine their own capacity for helping isolated neighbors. The newspaper story caught the attention of national media outlets, but William and Catherine's press office worked carefully to ensure that coverage remained focused on the important issues rather than treating the visit as a typical royal news story. They released a brief statement confirming that the prince and princess had visited Mrs. Thompson in response to her letter and had been deeply moved by her story and Harold's service. The statement emphasized their commitment to highlighting the challenges facing elderly people throughout the United Kingdom and their admiration for the community response that Margaret's experience had generated. The national coverage proved to be a turning point that none of them could have anticipated. Rather than generating the usual cycle of royal news that quickly fades for public attention, Margaret's story seemed to touch something deeper in the British consciousness. Social media filled with stories from people who had been inspired to reach out to elderly relatives, neighbors, and community members. Local organizations reported dramatic increases in volunteer applications and donations aimed at supporting isolated elderly residents. The response was particularly strong among military families and postal workers who recognized Harold's story as representative of thousands of men and women who had served their country and communities with dedication and dignity, but had never received public recognition. Veterans organizations began developing programs specifically designed to support elderly former service members facing isolation and health challenges. Most remarkably, Margaret's story inspired similar acts of kindness from other public figures and ordinary citizens alike. A famous television presenter visited her elderly former teacher who had influenced her career. A professional footballer spent an afternoon with a retired groundskeeper who had maintained his childhood football pitch. A successful businesswoman traveled across the country to thank her grandmother's former neighbor who had provided care during difficult times decades earlier. The phenomenon was christened Margaret's Movement by social media users, and #Margaret's Movement became a hashtag associated with stories of intergenerational kindness and recognition for unsung heroes. The trend transcended social and economic boundaries, inspiring people from all backgrounds to identify elderly individuals in their own lives who deserved acknowledgement and support. William and Catherine found themselves overwhelmed by the response to their simple gesture. They had expected to brighten one elderly woman's day and perhaps inspire a few local acts of kindness. Instead, they had accidentally catalyzed a national conversation about aging, isolation, and the responsibility of younger generations to honor and support their elders. 3 weeks after their initial visit, William and Catherine returned to Yorkshire to see how Margaret was adapting to her new circumstances. They found her cottage transformed by the volunteer support network that had developed around her. The garden was immaculately maintained by a rotation of local volunteers who had also become regular companions and assistants. Margaret's refrigerator was covered with photographs and notes from children at the local school who had adopted her as their honorary grandmother and visited weekly to hear stories about life during the war and post-war periods. Margaret herself appeared to have gained 10 years of vitality. She was sleeping better, eating regularly, and had regained the sense of purpose that had characterized her earlier life. The daily visits from volunteers and children had given her new stories to tell and reasons to look forward to each day. Most importantly, she no longer felt forgotten or useless, but instead recognized herself as a valuable repository of history and wisdom that her community was eager to preserve and share. The support network had also made it possible for Margaret to delay her move to the care facility. Her doctors had been amazed by her improved mental and physical health and had agreed that she could remain in her cottage indefinitely as long as the current level of support continued. Margaret's medications were now managed by a visiting nurse. Her meals were supplemented by neighbors who enjoyed cooking for someone who appreciated their efforts, and her safety was monitored by friends who genuinely cared about her well-being. During their second visit, William and Catherine met many of the volunteers who had been inspired by Margaret's story to become involved in community support efforts. They spoke with teenagers who had discovered that elderly neighbors had fascinating stories to tell about historical events they had only read about in textbooks. They met middle-aged residents who had found unexpected fulfillment in providing practical assistance to people who had once been the backbone of their community. The volunteers reported that they were receiving far more from their relationships with elderly neighbors than they were giving. Many described gaining new perspectives on resilience, commitment, and the importance of community connections. Some had developed surrogate grandparent relationships that enriched their children's lives and provided elderly residents with the intergenerational contact they craved. Margaret had become the unofficial coordinator of expanding network that now included dozens of elderly residents and over 100 volunteers throughout the region. Her cottage had become a meeting place where people planned activities, shared resources, and celebrated the birthdays and milestones of community members who might otherwise have been forgotten. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret's relationship with her own past and future. Instead of viewing her remaining time as a period of decline and loss, she now understood herself as a bridge between generations and a guardian of important memories. She had begun working with local historians to document Harold's postal route and the stories of families he had served over the decades. She was also collaborating with the village school to develop a program where elderly residents would share their memories of local history with young students. Margaret's story had evolved from a tale of isolation and impending loss into a celebration of community resilience and the power of individual kindness to create lasting change. She had written her letter to the royal family as a lonely widow preparing to leave everything familiar behind. She had become the catalyst for a movement that was transforming how her entire region thought about aging, community responsibility, and the value of every individual story. When William and Catherine prepared to leave after their second visit, Margaret walked them to their car with steady steps and clear eyes. She thanked them not just for the initial visit that had changed her life, but for showing her that simple gestures of kindness could have implications far beyond what anyone might imagine. She told them that Harold would have been proud to know that their love story had inspired so many other people to examine their capacity for caring and service. As they drove back toward London, William and Catherine reflected on how much they had learned from Margaret and from witnessing the community response to her story. They had always understood their royal platform as a way to highlight important causes and inspire positive action. But Margaret's experience had taught them that sometimes the most powerful interventions were the most personal ones, and that authentic human connections could create ripple effects that extended far beyond any formal program or initiative. They had also gained a deeper appreciation for the countless Margaret Thompsons throughout the United Kingdom who were facing similar challenges of aging, isolation, and loss without any expectation of recognition or assistance. Margaret's story had given them a model for how individual acts of kindness could multiply into community-wide movements that address systemic problems through grassroots action and personal commitment. Most importantly, they had learned that their own capacity for making a difference was not limited to their formal royal duties or public appearances. Sometimes the most meaningful contributions came from responding to a handwritten letter with genuine interest and compassion, from taking time to listen to stories that might otherwise be forgotten, and from treating every individual with the dignity and attention they deserved regardless of their social status or public visibility. 6 months after their first visit to Margaret Thompson's cottage, the impact of that single afternoon had grown beyond anything William and Catherine could have imagined. What began as a private response to one elderly woman's letter had evolved into a nationwide movement that was changing lives across the United Kingdom and inspiring similar initiatives in countries around the world. The transformation was most visible in Margaret's own village, which had become a model for intergenerational community support. The local council had officially recognized the volunteer network that had grown around Margaret's story, providing funding for transportation services, equipment loans, and coordination activities. The village school had developed a formal curriculum incorporating elderly residents as living historians, creating a program that other educational institutions throughout Yorkshire were now adapting for their own communities. Margaret herself had become an unlikely celebrity, though she remained committed to using her newfound visibility to advocate for other elderly people facing similar challenges. She had been invited to speak at conferences on aging and community support, traveling with volunteer companions to share her story and encourage the development of similar programs in other regions. Her message was always the same. Every elderly person had valuable stories to tell and contributions to make, and communities were stronger when they created opportunities for meaningful intergenerational connections. The cottage that had once felt like a prison of isolation had been transformed into a vibrant center of community activity. Margaret's sitting room hosted weekly tea parties where elderly residents and their younger neighbors gathered to share stories, celebrate birthdays, and plan collective activities. Her garden had become a demonstration plot where experienced gardeners taught children and teenagers about traditional growing methods and the importance of preserving heirloom plants and techniques. Harold's military medals and memorabilia had found permanent homes in local museums and veteran centers, but Margaret had kept copies and documentation that she used to educate visitors about the experiences of her husband's generation. She had collaborated with military historians to create detailed accounts of Harold's service and the broader experiences of working-class soldiers during and after World War II. These materials had been incorporated into educational resources that were now being used in schools throughout the region. The postal route that Harold had walked for 42 years had been commemorated with a historical trail that visitors could follow while learning about the evolution of mail delivery services and the role of postmen in maintaining community connections. Local tourism officials had been surprised by the interest the trail generated, and they were developing additional historical walking tours that celebrated other forms of community service and ordinary heroism. But the most significant change was in Margaret's own sense of purpose and vitality. At 87, she was busier and more engaged than she had been in years. Her dementia symptoms had stabilized and, in some ways, improved as a result of the constant mental stimulation and social interaction. Her doctors attributed her remarkable health improvements to the sense of purpose and community connection that had replaced the isolation and depression that had characterized her life immediately after Harold's death. Margaret had also become a mentor to other elderly people who were struggling with similar challenges. She received letters from widows and widowers throughout the country who had heard her story and were seeking advice about coping with loss and finding new meaning in their remaining years. Margaret responded personally to each letter, often arranging for local volunteers to visit letter writers and help them connect with community resources and support networks. The national impact of Margaret's movement continued to expand in unexpected directions. Corporate employers began developing programs that encouraged workers to spend volunteer time with elderly community members, recognizing that these relationships provided valuable professional development opportunities while addressing important social needs. Universities created service learning programs that paired students with elderly residents for research projects, oral history collection, and practical assistance. Healthcare systems had taken notice of the dramatic improvements in Margaret's physical and mental health following her increased social engagement. Medical researchers were studying the correlation between community connection and health outcomes among elderly patients, using Margaret's experience as a case study for the therapeutic value of intergenerational relationships and purpose-driven activities. The story had also inspired changes in how care facilities approach their relationships with surrounding communities. The facility where Margaret had been scheduled to move had completely restructured their programming to emphasize community integration rather than institutional isolation. They had developed partnerships with local schools, churches, and volunteer organizations that ensured residents maintained meaningful connections with a broader community rather than being separated from the social networks that had sustained them throughout their lives. International attention had been equally remarkable. Margaret had received correspondence from elderly people and community organizations in dozens of countries, all expressing gratitude for the inspiration her story had provided. Similar intergenerational support networks were developing in communities from rural Ireland to suburban Australia, adapted to local customs and needs, but based on the fundamental principle that elderly community members deserved recognition, support, and ongoing opportunities to contribute their knowledge and experience. William and Catherine had continued their relationship with Margaret through regular visits and correspondence, but they had also used the platform her story provided to advocate for broader policy changes addressing elderly isolation and community support. They had testified before parliamentary committees about the need for increased funding for volunteer organizations and community programs. They had also used their international influence to promote similar initiatives during official visits to other countries. The couple had been particularly moved by the response from young people who had been inspired by Margaret's story to examine their relationships with their own elderly relatives and neighbors. Social media platforms continued to feature stories from teenagers and young adults who had reached out to grandparents, elderly neighbors, and isolated community members after learning about Margaret's experience. Many reported that these relationships had provided unexpected insights into history, family heritage, and the challenges and opportunities of aging. Professional organizations had also embraced Margaret's movement as a model for corporate social responsibility and employee engagement. Law firms, accounting practices, and consulting companies were organizing volunteer programs that connected their employees with elderly community members who needed assistance with legal documents, financial planning, and technology support. These partnerships provided valuable services while giving younger professionals opportunities to develop mentoring skills and broader perspectives on life experiences. The publishing industry had taken notice as well. Margaret's story had inspired dozens of books collecting oral histories from elderly community members, documenting traditional skills and knowledge, and exploring the social and emotional challenges of aging in contemporary society. Margaret herself had collaborated on a memoir that combined her personal story with broader reflections on love, loss, community, and the importance of recognizing every individual's inherent dignity and worth. Perhaps most remarkably, Margaret's story had influenced how families approach conversations about aging and end-of-life planning. Rather than viewing these discussions as morbid or uncomfortable, many families have been inspired by Margaret's example to create opportunities for elderly relatives to share their stories, document their experiences, and identify ways they could continue contributing to their communities regardless of their physical limitations. The anniversary of William and Catherine's first visit to Margaret's cottage was marked by celebrations throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. Community organizations hosted events recognizing elderly residents, and their contributions. Schools organized intergenerational programs where students interviewed elderly community members about their life experiences. Churches and civic organizations developed awards recognizing individuals who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to supporting elderly neighbors and relatives. Margaret attended the Central Anniversary celebration in London, traveling by train with a delegation of volunteers and friends from her village. She was introduced to other elderly people whose lives had been transformed by the movement her story had inspired, and she met young volunteers who credited her example with motivating their own community service commitments. During the celebration, Margaret was presented with an honor recognizing her contribution to community welfare and her advocacy for elderly people throughout the United Kingdom. But in her acceptance speech, she emphasized that the real heroes were the countless individuals who had responded to her story by reaching out to isolated elderly neighbors, relatives, and community members in their own lives. Harold and I lived ordinary lives, Margaret told the audience. We never expected recognition or special attention, but we learned that ordinary lives lived with love and commitment can have extraordinary impact when other people choose to notice and care. The real miracle of this movement is not what happened to me, but what all of you have chosen to do for elderly people in your own communities who needed to know that their lives mattered and their stories were worth preserving. William spoke at the celebration about how Margaret's letter had changed his and Catherine's understanding of their role as public figures and their capacity to make meaningful differences in individual lives. He emphasized that Margaret's story demonstrated the power of authentic human connections to create positive change that extended far beyond what any formal program or policy initiative could achieve. Catherine focused her remarks on the lessons Margaret's experience offered about resilience, community, and the importance of recognizing the inherent dignity and potential contribution of every individual regardless of their age or circumstances. She challenged the audience to consider how they could apply Margaret's example in their own relationships and communities, not just with elderly people, but with anyone who might be feeling isolated or undervalued. As the celebration concluded, Margaret was surrounded by people wanting to thank her for the inspiration her story had provided. But she consistently redirected their gratitude toward the volunteers, neighbors, and community organizations that had transformed her life and were continuing to support elderly people throughout the country. She reminded everyone that her experience demonstrated not her own special qualities, but the remarkable capacity for kindness and community support that existed everywhere when people chose to notice and respond to the needs of their neighbors. The journey home to Yorkshire was filled with reflection on how much had changed since that morning 6 months earlier when Margaret had answered her door to find the Prince and Princess of Wales on her doorstep. She had written her letter as a lonely widow preparing to leave everything familiar behind. She was returning as the catalyst for a movement that had transformed thousands of lives and created new models for community support and intergenerational connection. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Margaret's story was how completely it had redefined what it meant to matter. Margaret had spent her life caring for others without expecting recognition, and Harold had served his community and country with dedication that went largely unnoticed. Their simple gesture of sharing their story with strangers had demonstrated that every individual life had the potential to inspire extraordinary positive change when it was witnessed with genuine compassion and respect. As Margaret settled back into her cottage that evening, surrounded by photographs of new friends and relationships that had grown out of her experience, she understood that the most important lesson of the past 6 months was not about her own transformation, but about the unlimited capacity for kindness that existed in ordinary people when they were reminded of their power to make a difference in each other's lives. The letter she had written to express gratitude for a lifetime of royal service had become a catalyst for a movement that celebrated the service and contributions of ordinary people everywhere. Margaret had learned that the most powerful gestures were often the simplest ones, performed without expectation of recognition or reward, but with genuine care for the dignity and well-being of others. And in cottages and care facilities, urban apartments, and suburban neighborhoods throughout the United Kingdom and beyond, elderly people who had once felt forgotten and invisible were discovering that their stories mattered. Their experiences had value, and their communities were stronger when everyone was included in the networks of care and connection that made life meaningful for people of all ages.